What an interesting question. And I must admit that when I'm asked questions like that, my response is that there doesn't seem to be anything missing in the regulation as it stands. The intent seems very clear. I think a lot of the debate is not so much about the framework, but just how we should interpret the framework in our new digital age. Again, I don't want to go as far as to say we need to change them. But what strikes me, and this is because I'm an economist, is that we have vertical merger guidelines which were set up in an era of manufacturing, where we are interested in inputs into physical production. Now we live in a world where so much of commerce and interactions is governed by platforms. And it's never clear to me how to think about the vertical merger guidelines in this new platform era. And let's be clear, the world has always had platforms. It's not a new business model. Something like the New Zealand fish market is a platform. But what's happened in the digital age is digitization has allowed us to scale up beyond a small corner of Auckland, New Zealand, and make these platforms global in scale. And so I think what we've seen, and this is my major reaction when asked about the vertical merger guidelines, is we have guidelines set up for a world of manufacturing. And then when we're trying to think about platforms, I think sometimes there's a little bit of, should we say, open questions about how to think of them in this more digitized world. So I particularly love this question. And the reason I love it is I've just written an article on precisely this question. And look, let's talk about why this has come about. It's come about because in this world of digital platforms, you have these large organizations managing interactions between lots of different entities. Now, when I teach on the topic of platforms, what I always talk about is I say you have to have a real change in mindset beyond a typical MIT approach of thinking about a user interface, how well it works, and all these kind of things, to thinking about a concept we call query, which is about making sure these interactions go well. And I actually tell my students, I say to them, if you're running a platform, you have to be willing to accept the role of policeman and basically being a mini government. And the moment you put it in that language of being a mini government, because your job as a platform is to make these interactions go well, is, I think, exactly why we're seeing these calls for these to be treated more as some kind of essential infrastructure. Again, it's that sort of analogy to something which people think maybe the government should be owning. Now, I don't know if are you going to ask me if I think it's a good idea or not? Because I have opinions on that too. Well, I'm probably going to sidestep that question a little bit just because as an economist, I don't want to comment too much on enforcement. What I'd like to do is to, in some sense, just offer an opinion about the extent to which we should be treating, or that antitrust regulation should be moving towards this idea of managing platforms as infrastructure, which, as you said correctly, is one of the major things on the table. Now, one of the exercises I give my students in my platforms class is the question of what you should do, or what eBay should have done when mask prices went up tens of thousands of percent back in February and March 2020. And there's always, again, this idea, someone should have done something. And, again, if we're sort of thinking about, typical things we worry about in terms of consumer protection, we don't love things which look like price gouging or incredibly large increases in price. And so that's what goes back to the someone should have done something. And so students usually start off with that viewpoint, which I would say echoes your question, that someone should be doing something more. But then I ask them, well, what should someone have done? And at that point, it's less clear. And usually we end up with this uneasy conclusion, depending on who's in the room, that though no one loved what happened to Mosk, KN95 prices in March and February of 2020, it's not clear what government regulation would have been able to do. And it's also not clear the extent to which government regulation could have anticipated exactly what was going to happen. Because let's be clear, beforehand, all we were worried about with eBay was that every year, that year's hot toy or that year's hot PlayStation got overpriced. Completely different issue to what happened. And we end up with this uneasy sort of conclusion that though there's, everyone has a feeling someone should do something, when you try and articulate what that something is, it's not very clear what the role of government is. So I feel I'm answering actually a lot of these questions as a teacher, but I'm going to answer this one as a teacher too. So every year at MIT, we have all these amazing master students come in with these wonderful startup ideas. I have the pleasure of trying to teach them how to do monetization or how to make money. And I can't tell you the number of times, I try and talk them through a model, but it becomes clear that they're really not that interested in making money. Instead, the end goal is to be acquired. And, we'll always, and in their dreams, they're always going to be acquired by Facebook or Google. That's always the aspiration. And they'll tell me that maybe they're going to be as lucky as the founders of WhatsApp or something like that. That's usually the argument. Now, obviously, this is frustrating because it would be very nice if they'd figured out a better way of making money. But I think what it leads me to conclude is that we can't actually underestimate the incentives of acquisition among the entrepreneurship community. I don't think we have great numbers or great calibration about how large this incentive is, which is why my answer is so anecdotal. But I do worry that restrictions on startup acquisitions will have a large unintentional consequence on the hotbed of entrepreneurial activity I'm always surrounded with in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I am concerned, to be honest. I must admit, this is one of those ones that mystifies me a little bit again as a solution. And I'll explain why. I think, if you think about a lot of the arguments about why it is that, say, a large digital platform might have competitive advantage, They're all to do with synergies and the extent to which users on both sides of the platform are benefiting from their interactions and economies of scope and scale across different types of interactions. So the articulation of where competitive advantage is coming from comes completely from something we might have called in the old days synergies. And it seems that the solution of breaking up these firms is intentionally targeted at removing these synergies. However, let's be clear, those synergies are all about benefiting to users, so the consequences for welfare will definitely be negative. I mean, the only way, you can sort of justify it from an economics perspective is some idea that it would, by hampering synergies, by hampering consumer welfare in the short term, you're going to, in some sense, engender more dynamic competition. But, at least from what we know of the last 20 years of entry in the digital space, it's not been the presence of a large incumbent which has been really the limitation on that kind of dynamic entry. So I'm honestly, I find it hard to think through the economics which should justify breakup, given that the reason for breakup was always that there were just too many synergies. Okay, so this is a really tricky one, right? And I will give you my own candid opinion, though this is perhaps more a personal opinion than something coming from being grounded necessarily in economics. Because when we're sort of thinking about nationalism and global competitive, we're often stepping away from strict economics. This is my large concern. The US has had the most amazing stroke of luck blessing that every major tech platform has basically originated in the US. And if you think about it, it's just incredible that we have managed to achieve such global prominence in this digital era, right? It wasn't, if you're sort of thinking about it stochastically, it didn't have to happen, right? But for some reason, people based in the US ended up founding Amazon, they ended up founding eBay, they ended up founding Facebook, they ended up founding Google, and it's just incredible. And Netflix, it was just incredible, right? You sort of start having to go to Spotify to start thinking about firms not really located completely in the US. And I just think this is amazing. I mean, what a true triumph, if you're at all nationalistic in any way. I mean, it's just amazing. Now, so we've had this amazing national triumph if you're inclined to national pride. And then what are we doing? Well, we're launching a lot of antitrust cases. And what we know about antitrust cases is that they tend to distract organizations, right? We've seen it with IBM, we've seen it with Microsoft. It tends to lead to, at best, a hiatus on growth and innovation because the company internally gets distracted. And, that's worrying, right? That is worrying. I mean, we have no way of predicting what's going to happen in China, but maybe one way of sort of thinking about it is that at the moment, what's the major, what platform are a lot of people using in terms of social media in a country like Indonesia? They're using Facebook, they're using Instagram. By amazing global influence in some ways, what's going to happen if Facebook gets distracted and other tech platforms, say, for China come in. Now that's a geopolitical consequence. I'm an economist, don't want to talk too much about that. But I think it is a real risk given what we've seen as being the pattern of the effects of antitrust enforcement on innovation within these companies, and something we have to sort of, people with more of a geopolitical portfolio than me should be thinking about. Yes, I would like to make this final comment. I think, under the hood of all these questions is, concerns about large digital platforms. And, as someone who's studied them for decades, and, someone who's worked with them, admittedly, for decades, I think we often lose in the debate just how amazing they are and how blessed we are relative to 20 years ago in terms of our ability to access information, products, services just so quickly and easily. And I don't want that to get lost in what is ultimately going to be a very interesting series of videos on antitrust, just the huge benefits that these platforms